8,000 people on their feet. At the same time, the grandstand at the US Open is not a soft crowd. This is New York. This is a stadium that has watched legends come and go, a crowd that does not hand out its energy for free. And yet on this day, that entire arena turned into something nobody in tennis had ever seen before. A sea of Philippine flags, chants loud enough to bounce off the concrete and come back twice as loud. A 20-year-old standing at the baseline, hearing her name screamed by thousands of people who had crossed cities, states, sometimes oceans, just to be in that building. Now, here is the part that should stop you. Just a few years earlier, almost nobody in America knew who she was. Not casual fans, not tennis media, not the people running the tournaments she was trying to enter. She was a name on a draw sheet that most people skipped past on their way to the players they actually recognized. So how does that happen? How does a player go from being an unknown name from a country with no tennis history at all to turning one of the most famous courts in the sport into a home crowd? Because that is what this was. Not visiting fans, not polite applause, a takeover. And it did not happen by accident. It did not happen because of one lucky match or one viral clip. What happened inside that stadium was the visible tip of something that had been building quietly for years through a journey most people never saw, in places most people never looked. There was a period in her career when even the people closest to her were not sure this moment would ever come. There was a stretch that almost broke the whole thing. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how a girl who left home as a child, with no roadmap, no precedent, and nobody from her country to follow, ended up creating one of the loudest, most emotional scenes the US Open has witnessed in years. But to understand the grandstand, you have to go back much further than the US Open. You have to go back to a decision made by a young girl who had no idea if any of it would ever work. No precedent, no blueprint, nobody to follow. When Alex Eala left the Philippines as a child to chase professional tennis, she was not walking a path that someone before her had already cleared. She was walking into empty space. Her country had produced boxers, had produced basketball obsession on a national scale, had produced world champions in other arenas. In women's tennis at the highest level, there was nothing. No Filipina had ever cracked the top 100. Not one. Think about what that actually means for a kid. Every young athlete grows up watching someone who looks like them do the thing they want to do. A poster on the wall, a career to model, a proof of concept that says this is possible for people like you. Eala had none of that. She had talent, a family that believed in her, and a country that had never once been given a reason to believe a Filipina could compete with the best players in the world. She ended up at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, thousands of miles from home, 12 years old, living in a place where the language was not hers, the food was not hers, the culture was not hers, surrounded by kids from tennis nations with generations of infrastructure behind them. That distance is the part people underestimate. Not the training. The training is hard for everyone. The distance is what separates the ones who last from the ones who go home. Because here is what nobody tells you about leaving at that age. You miss everything. Birthdays, holidays, the ordinary days that turn into memories for everyone else while you are on a practice court hitting the same forehand for the 400th time. You call home and hear your family's voices, and then you hang up and you are still 8,000 miles away. And she was not doing it with any guarantee. Talented kids wash out of academies constantly. For every player who makes it, there are dozens who spent their entire childhood chasing something that never arrived. She knew that. Everyone in that building knew that. There was no version of this where she was safe. Now add one more layer. She was not just carrying her own dream. From very early on, people back home started noticing. A Filipina at Nadal's academy. A Filipina winning junior titles. And with that noticing came something heavier than encouragement, came expectation, came an entire nation quietly starting to hope, without ever asking her if she wanted to carry that. Most kids get to fail privately. She was going to have to do it in front of a country that had waited a very long time for someone. The junior results came. A junior Grand Slam title. Real, verifiable proof that the talent was not imaginary. And for a moment, everything looked like it was moving in a straight line upward, the way these stories are supposed to go. But junior success and professional success are two different sports wearing the same clothes. Every year, junior champions turn professional and disappear. The gap between beating the best 16-year-olds and beating grown women who have been on tour for a decade is enormous, and most players never cross it. If you have ever been the first person in your family or your community to try something that nobody around you had a map for, you already understand what this next part feels like. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because the story from here is going to hit differently for anyone who has carried that specific kind of weight. Because the straight line did not stay straight. What came next was the stretch that nearly ended everything, the years when the results stopped matching the promise, and when the people closest to her started asking quiet questions they never said out loud. There is a specific kind of silence that settles around a young player when the results stop coming. Nobody announces it. Nobody writes an article about it. It just happens gradually, in the space between what people expected and what is actually showing up on the scoreboard. That silence found Alex Eala. She turned professional carrying a junior Grand Slam title and the hopes of 110 million people. What she walked into was the WTA Tour, which does not care about junior titles at all. It cares about one thing. Can you beat grown women who have been doing this professionally for 10 years, week after week, in cities where nobody knows your name and nobody is cheering for you? The early answer was, not yet. Ranking somewhere in the hundreds, then the 200s. Playing tournaments most fans have never heard of, in venues with a few dozen people scattered in the stands, for prize money that barely covers the flight and the hotel. This is the part of professional tennis that nobody films. There is no crowd, there is no atmosphere. There is a court, an opponent, and a scoreboard that does not care how much potential you have. So here is the first question worth sitting with. How long can someone keep believing when the evidence stops supporting the belief? Because belief is easy at 16 when everything is climbing. Belief is much harder at 19 when you are grinding through qualifying rounds and losing to players nobody has heard of, and the headlines back home have started asking a different kind of question. Then came the injuries. Anyone who has followed her career closely knows this stretch. The body breaking down at exactly the moment the schedule demanded more. Weeks off, then months. Watching the rankings slide while doing nothing wrong simply because you cannot play. In tennis, the ranking is not a reward. It is an obligation. Points expire. If you are not playing, you are falling. And you are falling whether you deserve it or not. Second question. What does it do to a player who already had no roadmap, when the only thing she could control, her own body, stops cooperating? And this is where the weight becomes unbearable in a way that has nothing to do with tennis. Most struggling players get to struggle in private. A bad season is a bad season. You fix it or you do not. And the world moves on because the world was never watching in the first place. Eala did not have that option. Every match was national news back home. Every loss was analyzed by people who loved her and people who had never picked up a racket and people who wanted to see whether the hype was real. She was not just failing to break through. She was failing to break through while representing an entire country that had been told, finally, this is the one. Imagine being 20 years old and knowing that a straight sets loss in a tournament nobody attends is going to trend on social media in a country of 110 million people. Now stack the pieces. Ranking stalled. Body unreliable. National expectation growing faster than results. Living thousands of miles from home in a system that produces far more casualties than success stories. And the third question, the one that mattered most at the time, at what point does the dream stop being a dream and start being a trap? Because there were people around her, people who cared about her, who started thinking it quietly. Not out loud. Never out loud. But there is a version of this story that ends here, with a talented player from a country with no tennis history who peaked as a junior and never converted, who became a footnote instead of a landmark. That version happens constantly. That version is, statistically, the most likely version. Everyone knew it. She knew it. The junior title was fading further into the past with every passing month. The gap between where she was and where she needed to be was not closing. It was widening. And there is no rule in professional sports that says the story has to turn out well. Talent is not a guarantee. Effort is not a guarantee. Sometimes the door simply does not open, no matter how hard you knock on it. That is where she was standing. Not at a low point that makes for a nice comeback narrative. At a genuine crossroads, where the most reasonable projection said this career was going to plateau far below what everyone once imagined. Nothing about that moment suggested that a few years later, 8,000 people would be shaking a stadium in New York with her name. And then something happened that changed the entire trajectory. Miami, spring. A tournament she entered as a wildcard, ranked outside the top 140, with a draw that on paper offered exactly one realistic outcome. Show up, play well for an hour, go home. That is not what happened. She beat Jelena Ostapenko, a Grand Slam champion. Then she beat Madison Keys, who had just won the Australian Open weeks earlier. Then she beat Iga Swiatek, world number 2, multiple slam titles. One of the most dominant players of her generation. Read that again. Ostapenko, Keys, Swiatek, back to back to back. From a player who had spent the previous stretch of her career fighting through qualifying draws in tournaments nobody televised. This is the moment. Everything in this video before this point was leading here, and everything after this point flows from it. Watch what happens in the Swiatek match specifically, because that is where the story turns. Eala did not scrape through on a bad day from her opponent. She won it in straight sets, against a player who had lost to almost nobody outside the top 10 in years. On a big court, under lights, with cameras that had never bothered to point in her direction before suddenly pointing at nothing else. Slow this down for a second, because the details matter. At some point during that run, the sound in the stadium changed. Filipino fans in South Florida, and there are a lot of them, started showing up. Then more after that. What began as a handful of flags turned into sections. People were driving in, rearranging work schedules, calling family members to say, "Get here, you need to see this." She reached the semifinals, from qualifying, as a wild card, ranked outside the top 140. And here is why this was not just a good week. For years, the question hanging over her career was whether the talent could actually convert at the highest level, not whether she was good. Everyone knew she was good. The question was whether good translated into beating the actual best players in the world when it counted, on a court that mattered, with everything on the line. Miami answered that permanently. You cannot beat Ostapenko, Keys, and Swiatek in the same week by accident. Luck does not stack that high. That week removed the question from the conversation entirely, and it removed it in front of the whole sport. But there is something else that happened in Miami. And this is the part that connects directly to that grandstand crowd we opened with. Before Miami, Filipino support for Eala was real but scattered. People followed from home. People cheered from a distance. What Miami proved was that if she gave them a reason, they would come physically, in numbers, to a stadium. And once a community learns that it can show up and be heard, it does not forget that lesson. Miami was not just the moment her tennis arrived, it was the moment her crowd discovered itself. If you watch that Miami run live, you already know exactly what this felt like, and I want to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell us which of those 3 wins you still think about the most, because I have a feeling the answers are going to be split in a way that says a lot about how people experience this story. Now think about what that week did to the projection. Before Miami, the reasonable forecast for her career was modest. Solid tour player maybe, occasional runs, a respectable career that would have made her the most successful Filipina player ever without ever threatening the top of the sport. After Miami, that ceiling did not exist anymore. She had a semi-final at a WTA 1000 event and 3 wins over elite players as evidence. Her ranking jumped dramatically. Tournaments that had never considered her started offering entry. Sponsors noticed, media noticed. More importantly, she noticed. There is a difference between believing you belong and knowing it. Miami turned one into the other, and that shift is not something you can undo. Once a player has beaten the world number 2, every future match against a top player starts from a different psychological place. That is what a real turning point looks like. Not a nice story. A permanent change in what is possible. And what followed was not a return to normal. It was acceleration, one result stacking on the next, building towards something bigger than any single match on any single court. Watch what happened next, because the pace picks up fast. The ranking moved first, from outside the top 140 to inside the top 80 within weeks. Then it kept climbing. Direct entry into main draws instead of grinding through qualifying. Better courts, better scheduling, better preparation windows. Each of those things is small on its own, and together they compound into an entirely different professional life. Then came the tour-level final, her first. In Eastbourne, on grass, a surface nobody expected to be her breakthrough. She got there by beating players ranked well above her, and by holding her nerve in matches that a year earlier she might have lost by tightening up in the third set. That is the pattern worth noticing. Not the wins themselves, the way she won them. Before Miami, her tough losses shared a signature. Competitive for a set, then a drop in the second, then the match slipping away in ways that looked like a player who was not quite sure she deserved to be there. After Miami, those same close matches started going the other direction. Third set tiebreaks turned into wins. Deficits turned into comebacks. Nothing about her forehand changed that dramatically in a matter of months. What changed was what she believed at 4, all in the third. Then the US Open, a main draw appearance at a Grand Slam, on her own ranking. Not on a wildcard, not through qualifying, earned entry into one of the 4 biggest events in the sport, and this is where the loop closes. Because that grandstand crowd we opened this video with did not appear out of nowhere. It was assembled, one result at a time, over the 18 months you just watched unfold. Miami taught the Filipino community in North America that showing up was possible. Every result after Miami gave them another reason to do it again. By the time she walked onto that court in New York, the machinery was already in place. Group chats tracking her schedule. Community organizations coordinating tickets. Families driving in from 3 states away. 8,000 people do not spontaneously fill a stadium. 8,000 people are the accumulated result of a player giving a community reason after reason after reason to believe it was worth the trip. Here is the detail that almost nobody outside her camp talks about, and if you are still watching this far in, you have earned it. The pressure from that support is not free. Her team has had to actively build routines around it, managing how much of the noise she absorbs before matches, limiting exposure to national media commentary during tournament weeks, structuring her preparation so that the emotional weight of representing 110 million people does not walk onto the court with her point by point, because that is the hidden cost of being first. Every other player at that level carries their own expectations. She carries a country's, and the only way to survive that long term is to treat it as something to be managed deliberately, not something to simply endure. Which is why the grandstand moment matters more than it looks. For years, that national weight had been a burden, something that made every loss louder and every slump more painful. What happened in New York was the moment the weight flipped into fuel. 8,000 voices did not add pressure. They removed it. For the first time at a Grand Slam, she was not the outsider playing in someone else's building. She was the home player. Do you understand what that means at a tournament in New York? On a court where a Filipina had never been the crowd favorite in the history of the event? The tournament schedule started accounting for it. Organizers noticed the attendance patterns. Her matches were drawing crowds that ranking alone could never explain. That is the answer to the question we started with. How does an unknown name from a country with no tennis history turn one of the most famous courts in the sport into a home crowd? She did not do it with one moment. She did it by beating Swiatek in Miami, by reaching a final in Eastbourne, by winning the third sets she used to lose, by climbing from outside the top 140 into the ranks of players who belong at Grand Slams, and by giving a community that had waited generations something real to show up for. The grandstand was not the beginning of the story, it was the receipt. And what that receipt represents goes far beyond one player and one court. So what actually happened in that stadium? Not a tennis match. A country arriving. For decades, Filipino sports fans in North America had almost nothing in tennis to attach themselves to. No player to follow, no name on a draw sheet that meant anything personal. Then one 20-year-old gave them a reason, and 8,000 people answered by turning the grandstand at the US Open into the loudest Filipino building in New York. That is the payoff of everything you just watched. The Academy in Mallorca at 12 years old. The years of ranking stagnation nobody filmed. The injuries, the quiet doubts. Miami, all of it compressed into a single afternoon where the weight she had been carrying finally turned into something that carried her instead. But here is what makes this bigger than one player. Tennis has spent years talking about growing the sport in new markets, about reaching audiences it has never reached before. What Eala proved is that those audiences were already there. They were not waiting for better marketing. They were waiting for someone to represent them. Give a community that has been invisible in a sport one legitimate reason to show up, and they will fill a stadium without anyone spending $1 on advertising. The WTA is watching that. Tournament directors are watching that. Sponsors are absolutely watching that. Because a player who moves 8,000 people to a stadium is not just a competitor anymore. She is an entire market that nobody knew how to unlock until she unlocked it herself, and she is still early, still developing, still nowhere near the ceiling of what she might become. Which brings us to the question this whole story leaves hanging. If 8,000 people showed up for a rising player, still climbing toward the top of the sport, what happens when she goes deeper? What happens at a Grand Slam quarterfinal? A semifinal? What does that number look like when the moment gets bigger? When the stakes get higher? When the entire Filipino diaspora in North America realizes this is not a one-time thing but the beginning of a decade? Nobody knows yet, including her. But somewhere in Manila right now, there is a kid watching clips of that grandstand crowd, seeing a Filipina standing on one of the biggest courts in the world, with her name being screamed by thousands of people. And that kid is growing up with something Alex Eala never had. Proof. That is the thing that will outlast every ranking and every result. She did not just build a career, she built the roadmap that did not exist when she needed one. The next chapter of this is going to be answered on a court, at a tournament, in front of a crowd that is going to be even bigger than the last one. Subscribe so you are here when that number gets counted. Because the moment it happens, that is the video we make next.